Okay, so are you ready to dive into this? We've got this chapter from a textbook all about talent measurement.
Yeah, sounds fascinating.
It really does. And thinking about going beyond these kind of, like online personality quizzes, like what kind of pizza are you based on your music taste? So, moving into something a little more serious.
Yeah, like how do we actually measure things well when it comes to people and their skills and personalities, even their potential?
Yeah, it's kind of mind-boggling when you think about like putting an actual number on leadership or on creativity. Like, how do you even begin to do that?
Well, and that's kind of the thing, right? Like
Yeah,
just because we can slap a number on something doesn't mean that it's actually like a meaningful or precise measurement.
sure.
Like those online quizzes,
Right.
they can be fun,
Yeah,
but they're not exactly like rigorous science, right?
totally.
Yeah.
So, how do we make sure that our measurements are actually, rigorous and useful? What do we need to think about?
Yeah, totally. It comes down to understanding the scales of measurement. It might sound kind of like a dry topic, I
A
guess,
little bit.
but it's actually really interesting
Yeah.
because it's all about the different levels of measurement and what kind of info they can actually give us.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So there's like a hierarchy.
Yeah. So at the very simplest level, we have something called nominal scales, and these are basically just categories.
Okay.
So think about like sorting people by their favorite color. We're not actually saying one color is better than another. We're just like grouping them.
Gotcha.
Right.
So dog people versus cat people, that's nominal.
Exactly. But it gets a little more, I don't know.
Interesting.
Yeah, interesting, nuanced. With ordinal scales, this is where we introduce this idea of like ranking things
Okay.
from least to most.
Got it.
So those movie ratings
Yes.
with the stars, that's a perfect example.
5 stars
Yep.
versus 1 star.
We know that a five-star movie is probably better than a one-star movie,
Probably, yeah.
but those stars don't tell us how much better.
Right. Oh, that's true. Yeah. It's just giving you a direction, not like an actual distance between those rankings.
Exactly. And that's where like interval scales come in.
Okay.
They have these equal units of measurement, like temperature.
Oh, yeah.
So the difference between 20 degrees and 30 degrees is the same as between 70 degrees and 80 degrees.
Right. It's consistent.
Exactly.
Got it. So the chapter mentioned that a lot of these tools that measure talent, they use nominal or ordinal scales. Does that mean that they're not as useful, or like what should we take away from that?
I think it's not necessarily about being like useful or not useful, but just understanding the limitations.
Okay.
We can still get like valuable insights from those, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's just important to remember that we might not be capturing those like super fine-grained differences.
Gotcha.
Right.
It's all about the nuances.
Yeah.
Okay, so say we have our scales figured out, but then how do we actually start measuring something like leadership potential? Where do you even begin?
Yeah, that's where like the real work comes in, I think. And it really starts with being very clear about what we're trying to measure in the first place.
Okay.
So in that example, leadership potential, what does that actually look like in practice? What are the specific behaviors or skills that someone would need to demonstrate?
Oh, interesting.
Right.
So you can't just say we're measuring awesomeness. You have to actually define what you mean by awesomeness.
Exactly. You need like a blueprint, and that's where a measure plan comes in, right?
Okay.
This is like our roadmap for the entire development process. Like what content are we including? What format are we using? How many items? All of that.
A roadmap to awesomeness. I
Exactly.
love it. Okay, so you've got your blueprint. What happens next? How do you actually make sure it's good?
Yeah, so that's when we get to actually like test it out.
Okay.
We do a pilot study, we give it to a sample group of people, and just kind of see how it performs in the real world.
So like a test run to
Right.
work out all the kinks.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of item analysis comes into play. We're looking at each individual question. How difficult is it? Are the wrong answers actually distracting? Is this question really measuring what we think it is?
It's funny because I was thinking of taking standardized tests
Yeah.
and how it always felt like they were trying to trick you with some of the questions, but it sounds like there's a real science behind why those tests have different difficulty levels.
Exactly. A well-designed measure should have a good mix of difficulty levels because you want to be able to tell the difference between people who are really high in that skill or trait and those who are maybe a little bit lower.
It's like a spectrum, so it's
Yeah.
not just one size fits all.
Right. Exactly.
This is so interesting. The chapter also mentioned using item response theory for item analysis. Can you tell me a bit more about that? I have no idea what that is.
Yeah, so item response theory, that's kind of a mouthful.
Yeah, it is.
But it's basically a statistical approach
Hmm.
that helps us understand not just if someone gets an item right or wrong, but like the likelihood of them getting it right or wrong
Oh, interesting.
based on their actual underlying ability.
Yes, like looking deeper.
Exactly. The deeper dive into what's going on behind the scenes.
I see. Fascinating. But, even if we design like the most perfect measure, there's always this question of, is it consistent? Is it accurate?
Oh, yeah. You're getting into the concepts of reliability and validity now.
Ooh. I think that's probably a good place to stop.
Okay.
And we'll come back and we'll talk more about that in the next part of our deep dive. Okay, so back to the fascinating world of talent measurement.
Yeah. Always a fun time.
Right. So we're talking about reliability and validity, kind of like, are these tools actually trustworthy?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it like a measuring tape, right?
Okay.
If you have like the fanciest measuring tape in the world, but it keeps giving you different measurements every time you use it, it's not that helpful, is it?
No, not at all. So how do you know? How do we actually measure reliability then? If it's not that simple.
Yeah, there's a few different ways, actually. We have things like test, retest, parallel forms, and internal consistency.
Okay, those are some big words. Break those down for me a little bit.
Yeah, so test, retest. That's like the simplest one, I guess. You just give the same test twice
Okay.
with a bit of time in between, and then you see how well the scores actually match up.
So if I give someone the same test like a week apart, their scores should be pretty similar, right?
Yeah, ideally.
Okay.
But that's where that time interval is really important.
Right.
Because it has to be long enough that they're not just remembering the questions from the first time,
Right.
but not so long that, like, their actual abilities might have changed,
That's true. Yeah, you got to find that sweet spot.
Yeah, exactly. It's a balancing act.
So what was the next one? Parallel forms.
Yeah. So that one's a little bit trickier. Basically, you're creating two versions of the same measure
Okay.
that is as equivalent as possible, like twins. They cover the same content, the same difficulty level, but they use different specific items.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like, I don't know, like version A and version B of an exam.
Exactly. And then you give both versions to the same group of people
Oh,
and see how well their scores correlate.
that is clever. But I can imagine that takes a lot of work to create two versions of everything.
It does. It can be super time-consuming, which is why it's not always practical, I guess.
Yeah.
But the chapter mentioned a study
Okay.
where they were looking at situational judgment tests. And they actually just changed like the wording of some of the questions
Oh, interesting.
to create these alternate forms.
Okay.
But the scenario was the same.
Okay, cool.
So there are ways to get creative with it.
I like it. What about that last one? It was internal consistency. That sounds a little less labor intensive.
Yeah, they can be.
Okay.
One of the most common ones is something called Cronbach's alpha. And that basically looks at how well all the items on a measure hang together. So if all the items are supposed to be measuring the same thing,
Yeah.
you want to make sure that they're all kind of pointing in the same direction, right?
So like if you were measuring extroversion, all of the questions on that measure should actually be measuring different aspects of extroversion.
Exactly. And a high Cronbach's alpha tells us that the items are probably measuring the same underlying thing.
That makes sense, but I feel like there's always a but. Are there limitations with Cronbach's alpha?
Well, yeah, there always are, right?
Yeah.
It's not perfect. One issue is that it assumes all of the items on the measure are equally important to the total score,
Okay.
which might not always be the case.
Right, right.
And then there's that issue of scale coarseness.
Yes. Scale coarseness. We were talking about that earlier. Tell me more.
Yeah, so remember those different scales of measurement?
Yes.
Like nominal, ordinal.
Yeah.
Scale coarseness comes into play when we're trying to measure something that's continuous, like a personality trait.
Okay.
But we're using a limited number of response options.
Like those agree-disagree scales where it's like strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. Like sometimes I'm just in between those. Like I need more options.
Exactly. And that can actually impact the reliability and the validity of our measures.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it can actually make relationships between variables appear weaker than they really are.
Oh, wow. Okay, so what can we do about that?
Well, one option is to simply use more response options.
Okay.
So give people more shades of gray to choose from, right?
Right.
Another option is to use some statistical corrections to kind of account for that coarseness.
Okay, interesting. So it's something to just keep in mind when you're designing stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And this actually kind of ties into the broader idea of measurement error.
Mm-hmm.
Because no matter how carefully we design our measures, there's always going to be some degree of error.
Well, yeah, we're dealing with humans here.
Exactly.
They're complicated.
Yeah. And the chapter talked about how there are actually different types of measurement error, right? You've got your random errors. These are just kind of like, they just kind of fluctuate from one measurement to the next.
Okay.
And then you've got systematic errors.
Okay.
And those are the ones that are really tricky because they can actually bias our results in a particular direction.
So it's not just about minimizing all error. It's also about understanding what kind of error might be happening.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
And that's where this idea of generalizability theory comes in.
Okay.
It basically helps us understand, like, okay, how confident can we be
Right.
that the results we're getting from this measure are going to generalize to other situations or other groups of people, right?
Oh, interesting. It's like taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Cool. So that's reliability. Now, what about validity?
Ah, yes, validity.
The other big one.
The million-dollar question.
So if we're measuring something reliably, does that automatically mean that it's valid?
That's a great question, and it's not as straightforward as you might think.
Oh, no.
We could have a measure that's super reliable,
Oh.
but it's not actually measuring what we think it's measuring.
Right. So it's not just about the consistency of the number. It's about what that number actually means.
Exactly. And that's where validity comes in.
Ah.
Are we actually measuring what we intend to measure? And can we trust that measurement to guide our decisions?
Decisions like what?
Well, anything really.
Mm.
Hiring decisions, promotions,
Oh, okay.
even things like, educational placement.
Oh, wow. So it's really important then.
Yeah, it's crucial.
Okay, so how do we know? Like, how do we measure validity?
Well, it's a bit like building a case.
Okay.
We gather evidence from different sources to support our claims about a measure's validity.
I like that. Okay, so what kind of evidence are we looking for? What are the clues?
One important clue is content validity.
Okay.
And this is all about making sure that the content of the measure actually aligns with what we're trying to measure.
So if I'm trying to measure someone's cooking skills, I shouldn't be asking them to solve algebra equations.
See,
You get it.
I am getting it.
It seems obvious, right? It does.
But it's surprising how often it happens. We have to make sure that those items are relevant to what we're trying to measure.
So how do we make sure that the items are relevant?
One way is to actually get expert input.
Oh, okay.
People who are experts in that particular area that you're measuring,
Yeah.
because they can help you identify any gaps or biases in your measure.
So it's like having a panel of judges review your chocolate chip cookie recipe and make sure it's good.
Exactly. You want to make sure those cookies are going to impress, right?
Okay, what's another clue we can look for?
All right, clue number 2 is criterion-related validity.
Criterion-related validity sounds important.
It is. Basically, this one is all about figuring out if our measure actually predicts what we're hoping it predicts.
Okay.
So, for example, if we're using a measure to try to predict job performance,
Yeah.
we want to see if people who score high on that measure actually end up performing well on the job.
So if I go back to my sheet folding test and somebody aces it but can't seem to get any work done,
Yeah, red flag.
that's a sign. Okay, so how do we actually measure that connection, though?
There are some fancy statistical techniques we can use.
Okay.
But basically, we're looking at the correlation, the relationship between the scores on our measure and that actual real-world outcome.
So the stronger the connection, the more confident we can be in our measure.
Exactly. Now, within criterion-related validity, there are actually two main types: concurrent validity and predictive validity.
Ooh, more distinctions.
I know, right?
All right.
All right. So concurrent validity, that's all about how well our measure correlates with something else that's measured at the same time.
Okay.
So let's say we've developed a new measure of employee satisfaction.
Okay.
We could give that measure to a bunch of employees, and then we could also collect data on, like, their current job performance, their absenteeism rates, or even just ask them directly, hey, how satisfied are you with your job?
Okay, so we're seeing if our new measure matches up with information that we already have in the present moment.
Exactly. Now, predictive validity, it's a bit more future-oriented.
Okay.
It's all about how well our measure predicts some outcome that will happen down the road.
So, like, if you're using a measure to select job applicants, you would hope that the people who score really high on that measure actually do well in the job, like, a year from now.
Exactly. You got it.
That's so interesting. But I also feel like it would be hard to know because you have to wait for the future to happen.
That's true. Predictive validity studies can be really tricky to do.
Yeah.
but they're super important,
Okay.
especially when it comes to these high-stakes decisions, right?
Right. Because of these decisions, like we were talking about, they really impact people's lives.
Exactly. And that actually brings up a really important point, which is the ethical side of measurement,
Oh,
right?
yes.
We've been talking a lot about the technical stuff, but we can't forget about the human element.
Right. Because it's not enough to just have these numbers.
Exactly.
We have to think about how they're being used.
And the potential consequences for
Yeah.
individuals.
Yeah.
If we're using these measures to make decisions about people's lives, their careers, their educations, we have to be incredibly mindful of things like bias, fairness, and any unintended consequences.
That's a really good point. I think that's something that's really important to consider. We can't just blindly trust the numbers.
Right. Numbers can be seductive, but we have to think critically
Yes.
about the bigger picture.
So what's next? What are we talking about next?
Well, I guess that brings us to the end of our little exploration of reliability and validity.
I know, right?
Time flies when you're having fun with psychometrics.
It really does. Okay, so back again. We've talked about scales of measurement. We've covered reliability. We even touched on scale coarseness. Now it's time for validity, the grand finale.
Yeah, this is the big one, right? Like
Yeah.
the million-dollar question in measurement, is this tool actually measuring what we want it to?
Right.
And can we use those measurements to actually make decisions, important decisions about people?
Right, because as we said, I can make a really reliable test about, like, how fast can you fold a fitted sheet?
Please don't give them any ideas.
But even if it's a perfect test, that doesn't mean it's going to tell me if you're good at data analysis or web design.
Exactly. And that's where validity is different. It's not just about getting consistent numbers. It's about those numbers meaning something in the real world.
So they got to have, like, street cred, you know? They got to prove themselves.
Yeah, I like that. And it is like building a case, right? We look for different types of evidence to be more confident in the validity of a measure.
Okay, so how do we do that? What kind of evidence are we looking for?
Well, one really important one is called content validity. That's all about making sure that everything in your measurement lines up with what you're trying to measure.
Okay, so if I'm trying to, like, measure someone's cooking skills, I shouldn't ask them algebra questions.
Exactly. You got it. Sounds obvious, but it's really important. The items on your measure have to be relevant. They have to represent those skills or traits.
So how do we make sure those items are actually relevant?
Well, one way is to get experts involved, people who know this stuff.
Okay.
They can help you spot problems, things you missed, make sure it reflects what actually happens.
So it's like having, like, a panel of judges for your cooking show.
There you go.
Taste testing. Okay, so what's another clue we can look for?
All right, so another clue is criterion-related validity.
Criterion-related validity. Ooh, that one sounds serious.
It's a big one. It's about whether your measurement can actually predict what you want it to.
Okay.
So, for example, if I'm trying to predict how someone will perform at their job,
Right.
I would hope my measure could tell me that ahead of time.
So going back to my sheet folding test, someone could get a perfect score, but if they can't actually get their work done.
Yeah, time to rethink the test, right?
Exactly. Big problem. Okay, so how do we actually measure that connection between the test and the real world?
Statisticians would get excited about this part.
Oh, no.
But basically, we're looking at how well the scores on the test line up with what actually happens.
Okay, and the stronger the connection, the more confident we can be.
You got it. Now, there are actually two main types of this criterion-related validity. We have concurrent validity and we have predictive validity.
More terms. Okay, tell me more.
All right, so concurrent validity is about how well your measure matches up with something else, measured at the same time. So let's say you have a new way to measure how satisfied employees are at work.
Okay.
You could give them your new measure, but also look at other things at the same time, like how well they're doing at work or if they're showing up on time.
So you're checking if your new measure agrees with other information you already have?
Exactly.
Mm.
They're capturing the same idea. Now, predictive validity is a bit different. It's about the future.
Okay, so this one sounds tricky.
It can be. This is about whether your measurement can actually predict what will happen later on.
So if I'm trying to figure out who to hire,
Right.
I'd want to know if my test can tell me who will still be doing well a year from now.
That's predictive validity.
Yeah.
And yeah, it can be hard to study because you have to wait for the future to happen.
So much patience. But it's really important if we're making big decisions.
Absolutely. And that actually leads to a really important point about all this measurement stuff, which is the ethics of it all. We've been talking about the technical parts.
The numbers and the
Yeah.
stats.
But we can't forget about the people involved.
That's true.
These measurements, these numbers, They could have a big impact on people's lives, their careers.
It's not just an abstract thing.
Right. So we have to think about things like bias. Are we being fair? Are there unintended consequences we haven't thought about?
It's a lot of responsibility. We can't just blindly trust the numbers. We have to think about the bigger picture.
Exactly. And that's something that the chapter really emphasized. There's no perfect measure. Especially when we're talking about something as complex as people, there's always going to be some degree of error.
So we have to be aware of that, those limitations.
For sure. And be responsible with how we use these measures. Make sure things are as fair and as accurate as possible.
This has been eye-opening. It really makes you appreciate how much goes into measuring something like talent.
It's definitely more than meets the eye, and like we were saying, there's always more to learn. It's an ongoing process.
Well, on that note, this has been a fantastic deep dive into the world of talent measurement.
It really has.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. It's been a pleasure picking your brain.
Anytime. This was fun.